Welcome back, everybody. This week we've got two gentlemen from Hammerhead with us this week. Again, I've got Laz here and Rob, and I'll just let you guys kind of introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about who you are, what your guys' product is, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, well, I'm Laurence, co-founder and head of technology at Hammerhead. Early on, Pete, our CEO, approached me with an idea to help cyclists navigate. At that stage, it was nothing more than a 3D printed model and some hand notes. Pete had been working on this idea for a while. Most of the work was kind of understanding the needs of cyclists, both him and myself being pretty serious cyclists, and trying to find the team, the motley crew of initial people who were going to help him build this idea. So he needed a hardware person who was comfortable at least identifying vendors, scoping product, and sort of dealing with engineering of the physical product, and a software partner who could write the software required. A big part of the early thesis was, let's not distract cyclists while on a bike, but let's provide them all the information they need to follow a route or confidently ride where they need to get to.
Right. So like I, need to take a turn, on the right-hand side up here in 200 feet or something, right? Like very like visual with LEDs, right?
Exactly. And the shape of the product it looked like a hammerhead shark. So the company name was Hammerhead. It was the Hammerhead 1. And I told him I had roughly $5,000 in 6 months. And if this idea didn't work in that 6-month time frame, I was out. And that was really the beginning of that. And now 7 years later, we've onto our third generation of product. And we can go into those different products later in the podcast. But that's enough for my introduction, I guess. I have played hardware product role or hardware engineering role in the company from the beginning. But I've crossed over into software products, and obviously just general business function, wearing many hats like we have to in a small business.
Right. And just, you guys are about 40 people today, roughly, yeah?
Correct.
Gotcha.
Yeah. We're about 40 people,
Yep.
International. We're quite a distributed team, but we have a majority of our engineering resources within the States at the moment.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm Robert Martinez. I am VP of Hardware Engineering. Joined in 2016. Still here. I joined after the Hammerhead 1, and just when the Karoo 1, then HX was its project name, was that a pencil sketch and a half-page product brief on what Laurence and Pete wanted to do. And so that was how I entered the picture. And I think the way that you sold it to me was you were hiring me to replace you so that you could then work on the next biggest fire in the company.
Pretty much, yeah. It was, I needed someone who was willing to take on the sort of multitude of engineering challenges in the full scope of product development. And at that stage, we were still a tiny organization. I mean, we must have been about...
I think there were 7 or something?
I was going to say 7 people, yeah.
So that's read fires, not fire.
Yeah.
Multiple fires.
Exactly.
I mean, that's just how product development goes, right? I'm so glad you guys use that term as well, like put out the fire, because when you're early on in product development, you don't know what the next hard thing's going to be until it gets to you, and then you start putting them out, and eventually you get into the groove of, okay, now we're tightening the bolts down, we're getting into production, we're figuring out all those loose ends, but it's such an open-ended problem at the beginning, like a sketch, right, and a one-page product brief, and you got to figure out, okay, what's the hard part next? What do we need to fill? Like, how did you find, Rob to get there is one of those fires you had to put out.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's that, it's not an engineering problem most of the time, right? A lot of fires aren't just technical.
For sure. Some of the earliest problems, I think, in a business are often just resources. You are limited on every front for anything that you want to do. So you have to either have very diversely capable people to deal with those limitations and go and fill the gaps that you will undoubtedly have, or you have to have some other access to capital and outside resources, you know, and you will pay for those outside resources. But yeah, early on in a business, when you face kind of trade-offs of what can we make that is going to be good, you can only make a certain amount of things that are going to be good, whether it is, you know, focus on product development or focus on marketing or business development. You really do have to take the sort of very small crew of people that you have, augment them with whatever resources you're missing, so through contractors, which we've done historically, and then drive towards the things that are going to get you to the most meaningful next milestone. And you know, we can go into specifics on maybe a few of those with examples of product development over the years. Yeah.
No, and I think that the multifaceted like team early on is something we were talking about earlier, that is such a unique person to find in engineering. You know, a lot of engineers go to school and they specialize, right? I'm a mechanical engineer. I specialize in steels and aluminums and metal forming, right? Or I specialize in plastics. And you get these guys that are either early in their career and specialized or like studied this for a master's degree. And that's not who you really need for an earlier stage product development, right? You're looking for a guy that's not afraid to work on plastics, but then also help write software spec.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do I make this entirety of a thing feel good and be what I would like to produce and deliver to the world? I think that's such a unique part of what startup hardware companies do, is that they're having to go through the entire process of not just the plastics, but the physical good or the electronics or the software. What is important with my team and the time that we have, and what do we focus on to make it unique? One of the questions I'd love to ask is, what did you guys think collectively was that killer thing about the Crew One when you were developing? What was the one you weren't willing to put on the budget line of like feature or you know, big thing you wanted to focus on?
Screen.
Yeah, I think that was a major thing. You know, we looked at the current landscape of bike computers and were, you know, felt like they were great pieces of hardware. They achieved a function very well, like, but the technology wasn't necessarily in a state that really unlocked software potential. And a big early kind of driving element for us was, let's put a very nice looking screen on a bike computer that has, you know, rich colors, is much more reflective of smartphone technology, but can still be legible in sunlight. And that was an interesting sourcing challenge. You know, there's not many screens in the world that can both be legible in sunlight, have high pixel density, a lot of colors, and still be low power enough to last all day, like a bike computer requires.
Right.
You know, your smartphone, you turn it on and off all day, and you do not run it with the screen on with navigation, logging sensor data in broad blazing sunlight on a bike under extreme shock and vibration.
Well, I feel like the size of your display too is kind of in a no man's land, right? Because cell phone screens obviously have gotten way bigger over the years. I mean, even when the days of Crew 2, I mean, screen sizes were already going up, right? And obviously any kind of screen development is really like very custom, you know, so you either have to have the money to develop that, you know, a screen just for your application, or really kind of piggyback on what existing options there are in the market, right?
Well, so now you're getting right into like where we get constrained very early.
Sure.
Right. It's like we knew that we wanted to run something off of Android, right? So, you know, of course that constrains you in like what kind of platforms you can run that on. And then screen being the other big one, you've pointed out exactly. There was no way we were ever going to raise enough capital or have enough time to develop, you know, the best screen to fit the form factor that we wanted. And so there are not many players in that no man's land. And often, you know, they built it for a different application entirely, not smartphones. And so, you know, we got pretty lucky. I think it was Laz that found our vendor. And, you know, that's something where getting into like the holistic picture, it's one thing to identify that a component as important as this exists. It's a whole other thing to be able to actually talk to the people who make it and have them give you time of day.
Yep.
And there's yet a third thing to actually ink a deal with them where they're willing to sell it to you and deal with you as such a small fish.
Right. And then support you and give you early prototypes before your main orders. And like that's the other whole wonderful world of product development is it's great when you can go commit large POs and you're ready to go and manufacture and the vendor's going to make money. But it's also this, what I'll call like interpersonal game of convincing a vendor that they should bet on you and give you some engineering time up front and prototypes that you can, buy at cost, but they don't make money on that, right? And how do you convince them to build that relationship? And I think that's something you guys have done really, really well is your supply chain relationship you guys built, right? That was like the core to you guys being successful.
Certainly some of the vendors, like the screen vendor, was a critical vendor to maintain. And we were always in tension, like Rob said, with just their expectations of unit volumes versus our growth as a business. You can tell a vendor you're going to make hundreds of thousands of units a year.
Sure.
But they don't believe you until you order hundreds of thousands of units a year.
Sure.
It really, if the POs are coming, they're happy. If they're not, you're really just like everyone else and kind of trying to buy their product and trying to get the lowest price.
When you're super early stage and you're in China, oftentimes a PO is a late stage relationship, like achievement. Like oftentimes it's just like you need to place a deposit of some eye-wateringly high amount for one of your most expensive components, and then they'll start making it for you, right? So it's like a lot of where things get lost in the weeds, or not even lost in the weeds, like is not internalized on day one, is that you need to have a lot of money in order to even begin your first manufacturing run. And that first manufacturing run has with it so much uncertainty for all the players. Are they going to actually deliver what they're saying they're going to?
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, most people who are in hardware who have negotiated any kind of manufacturing deal will always come back to payment terms, right? And if you're in your first negotiation with a vendor who you've never engaged with before, they are going to try dial those terms as much to secure levels for themselves as possible. We will only start this with 50% down payment or something of those of that order.
And it leaves our dock after you've paid off all of them, right? If they don't trust you yet, right? And that's I think the challenge dealing internationally is in the US, there's a little bit more to hold people to the fire and getting net 30 and chasing them up if they don't pay you. But across international borders, this gets harder and harder, right?
Well, so that's where in Crew 1, that was like why I moved to China so early on, because it was really clear that the whole ecosystem for what we were trying to leverage, which was like the cell phone manufacturing ecosystem, which Shenzhen is the capital of the world for that.
Right.
Where, we are too small of a team to pay someone just to be there full time. And our best way to enforce any agreement is to make sure I was just like a DD cab ride away from any vendor, so that if anything went wrong or if I suspected anything, just shoot them a WeChat message, be like, I will be there
in 5 minutes.
Well, I mean, it's a large place.
Yeah.
Right? It's like larger than the size of LA. So it's like, I'll be there within 2 hours.
Right. What was that like? I mean, obviously you grew up in the U.S. Had you ever really spent time abroad for any significant period of time before moving there?
Never lived abroad.
Got it.
No.
Yeah.
It was very much just signing up for the adventure.
Yeah.
And I mean, it was not part of the deal, right? It's like, this was not a thing.
It wasn't an expectation.
It was not an expectation, nor did Laurence or Pete ever ask me about it. It was just doing the first round of ODM vendor quoting and on site, just feeling out and audits and tours.
It became apparent to you at some point, during one of those trips, that maybe
first trip
to make this actually happen, I have to be here.
First trip was a 3-week trip. And by the end of the 3rd week, I realized that in order to enforce the contract I had just signed, I needed to be there in order to not just enforce the contract, also help with the design and the development. Because one of our top level strategies for Crew 1 was to find a design house locally in Shenzhen that already had a lot of their critical component supply chain built up for what they specialized in, which was not cycling computers. And so we would have to pick and choose which parts of that to use for us versus which parts would have to be new. And then anytime you're using something new design concept, new vendor, new part, that kicks off this whole chain of validation that you need to execute on well in order for you to not just be bitten, when you're too far to go back.
Yeah. And, credit to the kind of that recognition that Rob had, and that just for Hammerhead was such a critical kind of business outcome. The fact that Rob moved out there and was willing to really drive that product development process with the vendor that was going to ultimately build our product, meant that, one, we were able to build the product on a budget that I don't think would have been possible in any other structure. And two, ultimately deliver on a timeline and at volumes with manufacturing consistency that we needed to survive as a business. That product had to be sold by the thousands, and it had to perform reliably under very difficult conditions. Like, it's hard to overemphasize how harsh the cycling environment can be for specific types of riding. Not everyone is a maniac on a bicycle and racing 12 hours through gravel roads in the back roads of Tasmania, but those riders who rely on our product to do those things, and every other cyclist who relies on our product to safely navigate a route, expect it to operate in those conditions reliably.
Well, I guess I feel like it only takes one instance, to damage your cycling computer, damage your bike. I mean, even I remember earlier this year, I think like day 3 or 4 owning a new bike, I was just going along and there was just this giant crack in the road that I had hit, and bam, instantly gashed the rear tire, and to the point it wasn't even repairable, right? But similarly, I feel like even if you're not trying on a bicycle to go crazy, it's just part of the environment, right? You can hit a curb, or you can hit an object or something like that, and you have to build the product to be able to withstand that, right?
For sure. And for our business, and some of the reasons I was really eager to start this business kind of goes back to these points about people entering the world of cycling, or new cyclists feeling the weight of safety concerns, the kind of sheer amount of technical barriers and things that they have to learn about the bike to use it reliably. It's definitely, the barriers to entry to cycling are a problem. I really do. I fundamentally believe everyone in the world should ride a bike for whatever reason: transport, fitness, enjoyment, adventure. But if we could, as a business, and this was sort of early on what Pete and I really cared about, if we could, as a business, make that experience a little easier, build products to make that experience better, we would lower the barriers to entry to cycling and make it more enjoyable. Because it's often a sort of level of understanding of the sport, a comfort that you need to reach, that makes cycling kind of a thing that you return to. So many people buy a bicycle and then are on this arc of sort of development and just hit a barrier of fear or safety concern, or they have an accident, hopefully, God forbid.
Sure.
And then that bike goes into a garage and is never used again. And that's a super avoidable thing with just tools that make you more confident and kind of an incremental way of getting into the sport. So at a macro level, that's obviously what we would like to facilitate down the road.
Sure.
At a micro level, it starts off with simple things like, when you're riding, it would be great to ride a different route every time, so that you see new parts of your city,
right?
And you can be confident that when you load that route, you can get to your destination.
I think you key on a really important thing, which is the route, right? I feel like when if you're bicycling in like a new city, or even you're bicycling for the first time, I feel like, and this pairs a lot with safety. It's like, where can I ride my bike and do so like confidently and feel safe? Like, are the roads going to have a bicycle path, or is there, going to be a trail nearby, or like how am I going to go about that? And I feel like, again, one of the things that I think you guys have done like brilliantly online is like the ability to sort of like map out a route and look at, regular satellites, hybrid maps, or even ones that overlay trails, and sort of like lay down that route, load that into your computer, and then be able to just like follow that route and go out sort of with that confidence, knowing, I'm not going to all of a sudden make a wrong left-hand turn and be on like a 2-lane highway or something, or like putting myself in a situation where I'm no longer like comfortable. And sure, as time goes on, you build up, and depending upon how well like your local area, maybe that's not as much of an issue. But again, even for, I think, like myself, when we moved offices and trying to like figure out, okay, like how am I going to ride a bicycle if I want to the new office, and feel like I can do that comfortably for like a commute, right? Again, like used your guys' tools to sort of like plan that out. And over time, like I've tweaked it, right? Like you find, different ways to go about that. But I think that's one of the biggest things that I think bicycle computers in general, but specifically your product, I think offers to, maybe people that aren't as experienced in the bicycle industry.
Yeah, I would say we still have a long way to go with user experience for new cyclists.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. And that maybe goes back to how we were looking at early product development. We knew that a small portion of cyclists, or quite a big portion of cyclists, buy bike computers and use them. But they are very familiar with sort of patterns of user experience, features that they expect from them. There's sort of this industry inertia of what do these customers expect from a bike computer. Mm-hmm. But outside of that, I think a lot of cyclists say, well, they're not a racing cyclist, or like they don't need the data or need the navigation. And I think that's totally just a barrier that you can blur with just simpler user experience, and frankly, a better designed product that is, has familiar user experience to a smartphone, and is, just a lot more approachable, I guess, is a big thing there.
I'd say I should piggyback on that. Like you said, it's like a smartphone there in the experience portion, but that technology that built smartphones also helped you guys from the hardware and the underlying software perspective make a great product. And one of the things I think is really neat about what you guys have done is you've taken something outside of what it was in, right? Like this technology chain and this experience, and brought it into a very particular user group, a very particular need and niche that you guys saw. And that allowed your small team to make a product that really does feel wonderful, like in its space. And it was like a super cool way for you guys to leverage this technology that no one was putting in that space and make it your own. I think that's like a cool part of your story from hearing about it and knowing what you guys have done, is that you saw this ability to leverage what existed in a way that no one else had. And that was the unique, right? That was the really cool part.
For sure. And a lot of the Karoo One product thesis was, let's make that technology available. Let's build an operating system on this device with services that are very similar to what exists in the world of bike computers, but then the ability to update that product every fortnight. Every 2 weeks we can ship a software update, and we can be a lot more of a software company once that hardware is into our customers' hands. We can be actively engaged with our customer base. We can be actively understanding their needs, their concerns, the elements of the product that aren't meeting their needs, and then deliver against those at a much more rapid rate. So once we sell that hardware to you, it's not just you buying something at $399 and it's that thing forever into the future. You're buying your way into an operating system and a set of features that is well designed presently, but is going to update and improve every 2 weeks. And those earliest adopters of ours, the customers who bought the Karoo One, saw that. You know, they were fully bought into that concept. The Karoo one had a lot of features that they wanted that they didn't ultimately get until many, many months later. You know, a lot of those customers who stuck with us, who said, I'm not going to return this product, I believe you can reach feature parity or reach my feature expectations, got their feature eventually. And with Karoo 2, obviously we worked on a much more complete package with the first delivery, which is critical.
And most were like that, though. Not everyone. Some people returned it because they didn't like it.
Did Karoo have copy and paste on it?
Did it? I don't think so. But I mean, you could use a keyboard.
Sure. No, I'm joking.
What I was going to get at is that when we launched Karoo 1, there were customers who opened it up and said, I was expecting a completed product, right? And this is like a huge constraint for hardware companies, small ones in particular, is you need to ship something, right? Ship or die.
Sure.
But you are going to be constrained in your time. And if you ship something that is not feature complete in a mature space, of which our space is fairly mature, like players have been around for over a decade already.
And our customers are very discerning. The ones who already buy computers are discerning.
Yeah. And so, an initial headwind we had when we first shipped Karoo 1 was that the software was had a long way to go from what people were expecting to be parity with our competitors.
Right.
And so, I think in some sense, we're almost underselling the faith that our customers put in us when they actually pre-ordered our product and then didn't return it if they were underwhelmed when they opened it, because that promise kept going of like, well, now you have it, and yes, it should get better, and we're going to work to make it better. But in the meantime, we needed to have things on there on day one that you would never get from one of our competitors. And so bringing it back to like the hardware side of development, that's where the screen came in as the one thing that we knew was just going to like blow everyone else out of the water. And hopefully that's like a good enough day one feature where customers will still want to use our product even if they're waiting for Strava live segments to come out.
Right? I mean, it kind of almost like what you're describing in a way, like I'm thinking in my head is almost like the original iPhone, right? Like when it came out, it had
$1
this...
in a jar, man.
Yeah, I know.
$1 in a jar.
I hate bringing them up, but it is a good analogy, I think, because the phone wasn't nearly as capable as the competitors as far as the feature set were concerned. Like no app store, right? Like lots of limitations, but big, beautiful, gorgeous display could do the things that it did do well. So we just won't say their name anymore, so I don't owe you any more money. But I think to me, that's what it sounds like was essentially like K1 was we're gonna offer something that is fundamentally different that's being offered. It's not, we can't necessarily go toe to toe and compete for every single feature, but we will make the promise that we're going to try to get there eventually where we're on parity with features while still doing, these 5 or 6 things really, really well or do them in a way that's nobody else is doing them, right? Is that kind of the concept there?
Pretty much. I mean, so this is like top level hardware development strategy. Right? For that product, it had to have an awesome screen. It had to run Android well. Last thing you want is a Android experience, a product experience, where if you have a capacitive touch panel and you swipe your finger, there's a delay between when you get to the next screen. And that's a thing where we knew that could be a day one feature that is actually kind of a gimme compared to our competitors, where they either don't have a touch panel at all,
or there's delay,
or there's delay. And so from the hardware side, it was those two things. Also making sure that you're waterproof, which is not an edge in our competitors, but is like a table stakes thing. And it's a whole other part too. It's what
survivability
things,
on the bike.
It's like what things must you have that you can't compromise on, because you can't ship like a software update to a waterproofability bug.
So I was just going to bring up that this is the segmentation of what your guys' product value is. You really have 2 completely separate columns, but they rely on each other to be valid, which is hardware and software. You don't just sell a hardware product. Yours is a connected, very complicated software product that goes onto a wonderful piece of hardware that's bespoke for its industry, right? For what you're doing.
For the use case, yeah.
Right.
And I think the thing I wanted to ask about was like knowing that you can't software update hardware, right? And how did you guys prioritize the hardware features you wanted to put in, right? Because everyone, when they're drawing out the whiteboard product, has 1,000,001 features, and you pare that down to reality. And what was how did you go about finding out which ones you really had to ship with, and which ones you weren't going to do this round? Mm-hmm. I think that's a question I'd love to see if we could talk about.
Yeah, I mean, good question. With Karoo 1, I would say a lot of the initial product spec was a combination of kind of in-house knowledge, so whatever understanding we had and assumptions we had with the industry. Some aspirational spec that was really just saying this thing is a software powerhouse, and in the future we may need these tools, these radios or these sensors in the product to really unlock a certain piece of software. I think a lot of the spec obviously was cobbled together also from existing bike computers. We looked at what do existing bike computers have, what will customers simply not accept if we're missing that. So specific radios like ANT plus radios was a requirement.
Right.
The market for sensors in cycling is massive. There's an unbelievable amount of sensors. A lot of those sensors are relying on either Bluetooth
right.
or ANT plus, which is a different low energy wireless standard, which came before Bluetooth 4. So the spec, I think, really, Karoo 1 was our most ambitious product, considering the size and scale of the business that we had at the time. And the spec came together with a couple of fundamental blind spots, which are probably quite fun to talk about. One was it didn't have a beeper. And this is kind of honestly like a joke in the company now, because it really did hurt us. And in hindsight, we have data now on how many people care about beepers.
Right.
Sure.
If you're riding down the road and not paying attention to a screen, you need an audio tone to make you pay attention to the screen. Some people hate those things. Like they even don't like riding near other cyclists with these beepers.
Sure.
But some people absolutely rely on it for safety.
But if you have a beeper, you can mute it. You can't necessarily
Right.
software update a beeper into the device, right?
Exactly. So
No, you can't.
Unless you're really clever about playing with your power supply frequencies through your firmware updates.
Right, exactly.
And then we had a lot of things that we overspec'd. I often say this, but the customers who buy our products buy hardware that is far more capable than our competitors in terms of just raw spec. Like and if at the crudest level, the cost of goods is higher than our competitors. And obviously that's something that we would like to become more competitive with, because we need to survive as a business and make money. But at the same time, it does allow us to have a product that is very, very capable. And when we come up with fantastical ideas, it's really just a limitation of software development and product development bandwidth at that point. And I would like our business to start unlocking some of these kind of hidden capabilities of our product. And we have updates every 2 weeks. It's something that's not impossible to do.
Right.
And I think that foundational comment that you just brought up is why I asked the question. That you guys early on in your product development have to come up with a spec that is going to meet all of your hardware needs for all the wonderful software ideas that you have today and the ones you're going to have a year after launch, right? And you guys have to kind of be really creative when you're speccing this of what can we do and what could we do in the future with software and what is there in the hardware space I can put in today to enable that. And I think that's such a hard challenge that most people don't see when they go look at a hardware product.
For sure. And I think anyone starting to build a hardware product, or at least anyone who hasn't built one before, is likely way overly ambitious about software development timelines.
Right.
So if you have hardware blinkers on, and just imagine that the software team is going to magically solve all these features that you're just baked into the hardware. It's not the case.
Right.
And if you have software blinkers on, and believe that the hardware is just going to do exactly what you want it to. Not the case.
Right.
That's
No, for sure.
the bandwidth required to unlock a very capable hardware product is immense and is almost always underestimated.
Right. I think we've talked obviously a ton about like the hardware itself and like all the challenges that go into that. I mean, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about just like the Hammerhead team. I think one thing that's really struck me for a company that has a hardware product, you guys are sort of like super distributed. I mean, really at the end of the day, fundamentally, like you said at the beginning, Laurence, global, right? And that wasn't something that just came about because of the pandemic, right? I mean, you've kind of been built like that to a certain extent for a while now, right?
We were remote before it was needed.
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I know that you guys had, pre-pandemic had, headquarters and things like that, but sure. I think you guys have always kind of had that. So, I mean, maybe can you talk a little bit about just what you view as maybe some of like the pros of that, and then obviously maybe some of the downsides, right? I mean, it is got to be difficult sometimes in terms of having a physical product and moving things around and things, right? For people to prototype and demo.
I mean, there's a really obvious thing there from the hardware side, right? Just
right.
To get right to the root of it is much hardware development needs to be done co-located, because to understand how clicky is this button.
Sure.
I can pull out a gram force meter and measure it.
Right.
But you're not going to know the difference between 300 and 250.
Right.
You just need to try it out.
Well, and they can both read 300, but one clicks better.
Right. Yeah,
and
exactly.
it's that undescribable, I can't tell you it. You have to touch and feel this.
How quickly is this button? How does this latch feel? How does the texture feel? On a given TPU, for an over molding, for instance. How snappy is the touch screen? How bad is the glare? It's you just need something in front of you. And to get engineers in the same room and product developers just to look at it and all see the same thing without having to film it and send it, or actually ship it and wait for it to arrive, is a huge pain point. And so a blessing and a curse in the Karoo 1 days was that just having myself out in China meant that I could evaluate it all.
Right.
But it also meant that the rest of the Hammerhead team was basically meaning Laurence being the other hardware guy. They had to trust me that I knew how clicky something would be and could work on finding a solution. So
I will say you did a great job with the Hammerhead 1 buttons. I mean the Karoo 1. The buttons are amazing.
I'm mentioning the strengths. Right. We haven't mentioned size and weight at any point.
Right.
So I'll rip that Band-Aid off.
Yeah, they work really well with gloves too. So,
right.
Yeah.
Well, and so for Karoo 2, which bearing the lead, is in stores now. Please go buy one. Buy
Those
two.
buttons are, I would say, more elegant.
More refined.
More refined.
Definitely.
And I got the pleasure of understanding what clicky meant. Right.
Yes, exactly.
And that was a real process.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And with that, it's we had more people on the team at that point. Not many more, but they weren't all in Shenzhen or Hong Kong. And so that meant in order to evaluate button clickiness, you had to be sending prototypes around all the time. If you would normally make one of something just to try it, or make one of something with 10 different iterations to do a classic engineering thing, which is if you can't first principles your way to a solution, iterate, then now everything gets a multiplier on it, and it gets that much harder. And so that was a challenge we had in Karoo 2 being distributed, again, pre-pandemic. Now, that got even worse with the pandemic because I couldn't even go to Shenzhen. I'd moved to Hong Kong by that time. And so I was in that problem now too, where no one at Hammerhead that was a full-time employee could actually evaluate any of this without having to be shipped to them. I mean, but that's just the hardware side. It's
it was, yeah. From the business side,
everywhere. Yeah.
I mean, from the business side, it has a lot of the time been an advantage because we have a very international customer base at this point. Europe is just a massive cycling market.
Sure.
So things like customer support, it's good to have people in different time zones. And then in the world of software, where it's just very competitive in terms of the hiring landscape, we got lucky with one of our VPs of software being sort of outside of Pennsylvania, outside of Philly, and having a sort of really solid crew around him from his prior job. and attracting sort of local talent there, building this energy of some of them also being cyclists themselves, of software developers, that team is probably the most cohesive and built team together. But it could happen because we didn't force everyone into a head office somewhere. We didn't say, hey, we're hiring you VP of software, move to New York City, uproot your entire life.
Sure. I mean, he was close enough that wouldn't have been moving across the country, right?
Yes, and that's Brian. This is
right.
I can speak about a real person. But we certainly face that question now as we grow as an organization, and we want to increase the rate of product development and the scope of things that we are working on. We have a lot of ambitions as a company. We've already built 3 complicated products, and we obviously want to build on the value that we've built across those products. And that does mean looking at hardware product development in a more creative way than just saying, oh, we're gonna have a huge office and spend all this money on all this equipment and just force everyone into that office. It might not work. If we just took that approach dogmatically, I think it might end up breaking the things that are good about our current approach. But having everyone completely distributed and never seeing each other is also not an option. One of the reasons why we gather as a team is to click the buttons and bring out the force meters and run the test machinery. And we're probably just going to have to figure out how to do that more frequently or on a cadence that allows everyone to live their lives and develop hardware.
That's awesome. Well, guys, we really appreciate you. Obviously, you guys were here this week with us, so obviously, thanks for coming out and spending some time. Again, like you said, I think it's been great. Working together on some challenging, problems and things. I think there are some benefits. Obviously, sometimes when you can just literally, duke it out over a whiteboard instead of maybe a Zoom meeting. But sure. I think it's a really interesting, story that you guys have, and I think the biggest thing that I see, the more hardware companies that I talk to, is it's at some point it's almost about like survivability, right? Like I think if you can survive long enough to release multiple iterations and sort of like build on past experiences and features and really hone in on truly like what that customer voice is. And I think you guys, like, even listening to your story, you can kind of see that arc or that narrative sort of play out. I think it's super exciting where K2 is at, and it'll be even more exciting, I think, to see how you guys continue to iterate in the future. So thanks for coming on and talking to us about it today. And we'll look forward to maybe having some more conversations in the future.
Yeah, next time we come down to Glassboard, have us back on the podcast.
We look forward to it.
Okay, awesome.
And maybe next time we could be announcing some of the things we've been working on. Who knows?
Sure, maybe.
Be awesome.
Cheers.
Cheers, guys.
Thanks, guys.